morning, everyone. We're broadcasting live from Berkeley, California today. I want to thank my host here, Noah Alper, who's very connected to Pardes. And today's shiur I would like to dedicate to the memory of my father, Zev ben Yehoshua Falak. His yortzeit is on Friday. And I also have to say that I was up till very late last night seeing the Brit of my latest grandson on Zoom in Israel. So I hope that I'm going to be with you today fully in the shiur. Today, what I'd like to, maybe let me preface this by saying our Parashat Chayei Sarah, essentially has, thank you very much for the Mazel Tov, essentially has two main topics. Chapter 23 is the topic of the death of Sarah, which then resulted in the purchase of Ma'arat HaMachpelah as the burial spot for Sarah, but not only the burial spot for Sarah, but actually the first purchase of land in Israel. You could essentially say our anchor in the land of Israel. That's not what we're going to talk about. What I'd like to talk about today is the next section, which is chapter 24, which has to do with finding a wife for Yitzchak. Maybe I should actually preface what I'm about to say by saying that our parsha, in a certain sense, I don't want to use the term anticlimactic, but it's important to realize that Avraham, in terms of his personal development, reaches his climax in last week's parsha with the Akedah. His story begins in Parashat Lecha. In a way, it ends with Lecha in last week's parsha. And in terms of Avraham's, what you might call spiritual journey, the development of his relationship with God, that really climaxes in last week's parsha. What happens in our parsha is Avraham, in a certain sense, handing over his legacy and setting the foundation for the perpetuation of everything which he created in his life. And so therefore, the story that we're going to be looking at is Avraham seeing to it that he gets a wife for Yitzchak, so that Yitzchak will then be married, have a family, and obviously continue his legacy. So I would like to begin with the first reference that you have on the page, which is Rashi, chapter 24, verse 42. And Rashi quotes a well-known rabbinic comment, which is, Amar Rabbi Acha, Yafes sichatan shel avdei avot lefnei hamakom, the conversation of the servants of the patriarchs is beautiful. I might add, beloved, before the place, meaning God, mitoratan shel banim, even more than the Torah of the children. Shaharei parsha shel Eliezer kfula b'Torah, because the section of Eliezer is actually doubled in the Torah. V'harbe gufei Torah lo nitnu ela b'remizah. And there are many what we might call essential laws of the Torah that are not written explicitly and are only hinted at. Okay, so the first thing which I want to point out is something which actually bothered the rabbis. If you look at our section, you'll see that our section, in fact, has 67 verses. And not only does it tell the story of what actually happened in terms of, and here I'll use the language of the Midrash, of Eliezer finding a wife for Yitzchak, but it actually has him retelling what actually happened to Rivka's family. And so the issue which is raised in the Midrash is, why is the Torah going to such great lengths to tell me in such great detail this story? And if already you're telling me the story, then why do you have to then retell it? And that's what it says over here. You're doubling it by retelling it, hearing how Eliezer tells the story to Rivka's family. It just seems totally out of place in terms of the Torah that's so careful with its language, that's so meager in its descriptions. And the statement which we just read says that the conversation of the servants of the patriarchs is actually more beloved than the Torah of the children of Abraham. That evidently God really loves this story and is prepared to go into such great detail. And evidently it's as if God is enamored by the conversation of the servants of the patriarchs. So that's what I would like to examine today. And again, I want to preface this by saying the following. In the same way that in chapter 23, where we're told of the death of Sarah, where we also go in tremendous detail, with all due respect to Sarah Imenu, but ultimately the reason why the Torah went into such great detail is not just about the death of Sarah, but essentially because the Torah wants to really focus on, she is the catalyst on what is the first purchase of land in Israel, on the significance of Hebron. And by the same token, what I would like to say in our parsha is that it's not so much that the Torah is focusing on Rebecca and on, finding a wife for Yitzchak, as much as it wants to focus on the personality, the main figure in the story, who is the servant of Abraham. And that will be what we will be looking at today. Who is this person and why is that so important to us? So now let's begin with the following. If you look at reference number 2, this is chapter 15 in Breshit. And this is after the story which we discussed 2 weeks ago, the battle of the 4 kings and the 5 kings. And God appears to Abraham, and God says to Abraham, don't be afraid, I am your protector, you have great reward. And what interests me is the following, verse 2. And then Vayomer Avram, Avram says to God, Hashem matitenli, God, what will you give me? V'anochi holech hariri, and I am going childless. And then the part which I have highlighted is uven meshek beiti, and the son of my household, hu damesek Eliezer, is Eliezer of Damascus. Which means that in this verse, Abraham is pointing out that the person who is central to his household is Eliezer of Damascus. And the implication seems to be that if Abraham is childless, and were Abraham right now to die, this person, Eliezer of Damascus, is going to be the one who will then inherit him, who will then, quote unquote, carry on his legacy. And presumably Abraham is concerned about that. He's disturbed by that. And then Abraham actually says that even more explicitly when he says in verse 3, Abraham says, behold, you have not given me seed, and this ben mesh, ben beiti, this member of my household, yoreshoti, he will inherit me. Now, we're not going to go into that whole discussion between Avram and God over there about who will be the heir. But what matters to me is that this is the first time we're exposed to this individual who is called Eliezer from Damascus, who clearly seems to play a central role in Abraham's family, to the point where if Abraham ends up dying childless, it seems he will be the one to inherit him. And I will now add, and this will be the segue to our section, this person is not at all named in our section. So that's very, very interesting that the first reference that I gave you, Rabbi Acha, who talks about, the Parsha of Eliezer, right? But in our section, it never actually says his name. And we know that it's this person only because of chapter 15. And I'll just leave for the moment, why actually don't we mention him by name in our Parsha? So now let's look to reference number 3, which is the bread and butter of what we're going to be talking about. And what I'd like to do is, I'd like to actually read this very, very carefully, look at the different parts to see, and I've split it up in certain different sections. What do we have over here? And to then see what is actually happening in real time and how this is actually being retold by Abraham's servant. And ultimately, my goal is to see who is this person and why do we make such a big deal about him. So without any further ado, reference 3, chapter 24, verse 1. It says, V'Avraham zaken ba bayamim, Avraham was old, coming in days, V'Hashem beirach et Avraham bakol, God blessed him with everything. Okay, and we will come back to this in a little while. Vayomer Avraham el avdo zakan beito, and Avram says to his servant, the elder of his house, Ham moshel b'chol asher lo, who rules regarding everything in the house, Simna yadcha tachat yirechi, place your hand below my thigh. Okay, so I would like to start out with the following. It's very interesting. What is the verse, please? We just did verses 1 and 2, chapter 24. Okay, so what I would like to point out is Avraham in verse 1 is described as being zaken, old. And then when we look at verse 2, he says to his servant, the elder of his house. Okay, so I want you to realize that the word zaken can be translated as old, or it could be translated as elder. If it's old, so very often we might use the terminology, it's like somebody who's out to pasture. It's like, you've done whatever you need to get done in your life, and now you're ready to kind of prepare yourself for death, which to a certain extent might actually be appropriate here. But throughout the Tanakh, the word old is used for elder. Elder in the sense of somebody who is a leader, somebody who is very, very respectable. Okay? What interests me is the fact that we use the word zaken with respect to Avram, and we use it with respect to the servant. And this is going to become the beginning of what I would like to pursue in the rest of our session, the parallels between this servant and between Avraham. Avraham is old/elder, and his servant is elder. Okay? And I would also add that old, or being an elder, is also very much connected with wisdom. And we will see on a certain level as we go on the wisdom of Avram here, and we will certainly see the wisdom of his servant. Now, I want to point out that in verse 2, we have something which essentially might seem to be an oxymoron, and this is going to be at the core of what we're going to be looking at today. And that is that who is Avram speaking to? He's speaking to his servant, who is then described as his servant who's a ruler. who rules over everything in his house. So that seems to be a little bit strange, right? He's a servant, and yet you're calling him a ruler. And what I would like to pursue during the course of this shiur is how, in fact, both of those are true. And the major thesis, which we're going to be looking at, is how the more this servant is faithful to his master, the more he is a ruler. Now, I'm sure that there are many people here who've heard me speak about this in Parashat Bereshit, but I've had other contexts where I speak about it, that in my mind, a major concept in the Torah, which has to do with the first two creation stories based on Rabbi Soloveitchik's understanding, is that our role meaning the role of humans in this world, is majesty and humility. And in fact, what I want to show you today is that the individual that we're speaking about actualizes that dichotomy, that dialectic, that he has both majesty and humility. And I'd even add, it's the humility, the service which he has to Abraham, which in the end gives him his majesty. And as we will go on to see throughout the section, you could even see it if you look at my sheet, I've highlighted throughout the section how the word Eved keeps on coming up again and again, up to a certain point. And then the word Eved is replaced by the word Ish. If you were to look down on the page, you'll see this begins in verse 21, Pasuk Chaf Aleph. And what you'll see is that we go back and forth throughout this section. Remember, I said to you, never once is this person's name mentioned. Either he's referred to as the Eved, or he's referred to as an Ish. And probably the place where this really comes up, if we jump ahead to verse 61, when Rivka finally goes with this individual back to Isaac, if you see in verse 61, Samach Aleph, it says, Vatelachna acharei ha'ish, and they go after the man, and then it says, Vayikach ha'eved, and the servant takes. So in the same pasuk, we have the juxtaposition of referring to him as the man and also as the servant. So I just want you to see that this is essentially the crux of this section, this dialectic of being an Eved and an Ish, of being a servant and of being a ruler, of what I call humility and majesty. Okay, Sandra, you were very correct in pointing out that we actually have a similar type of thing later on by Joseph. And maybe if people just turn for 1 second, I mean, not turn, you'll have to, if you have a Tanakh, so you can follow. If not, you'll just write down the verse and I'll read it to you. This is later on in chapter 39 in Bereshit. Okay, let me just find it. This is when Joseph, excuse me, when Joseph is sold into slavery in Egypt. And then what we're told, if you look at chapter 39, verse 4, right? Joseph is purchased by Potiphar. And it says, and Joseph found favor in his eyes, vayisharet oto, he services him. And then it says, vayafkideu al beito, he appoints him over his house. The same idea, he's the servant who's appointed over the house, who has total control over the house. And by the way, if you look, right, at the first verse, it says in chapter 39, it says, Joseph was brought down to Egypt. He is purchased by Potiphar, who is the chief executioner. He's an Ish Mitzri. And then if you look at verse 2, it says, Vayihi Hashem et Yosef, Vayihi Ish Matzliach. Joseph. So again, I want you to see the parallel to our parsha. Joseph is purchased by Ish Mitzri, and Joseph becomes an Ish Matzliach. So there's a certain parallel which is being drawn by the two in terms of their significance. And by the way, subsequently in chapter 40, when Joseph is thrown into prison, or I should say it's actually not chapter 40, it's the end of chapter 39, when Joseph is thrown into jail because of the incident with Mrs. Potiphar. So Joseph is once again a slave because he's been thrown into jail in a pit, okay, which is what might be seen as the ultimate expression of slavery. And yet what you find is that Joseph then is placed in charge of all of the prisoners, okay? And the language is very similar to what happened in the house of Potiphar. So yes, Joseph is parallel to what we have over here. Now, what do we have over here? So let's go back. Here is Abraham, who is now calling his servant, right, who rules over his house, and says to him, Simna yatcha tachat yirechi, place your hand below my thigh. And then in verse 3, V'yashpiacha b'Hashem elokei hashamayim elokei haaretz, I want you to take an oath by God. Asher lo tikach isha livni mibnot haknaani asher anochi yoshev b'kirbo. I don't want you to take a wife from the Canaanites in whose midst I dwell. Ki el artzi v'el moladati telech, but rather to my land and to my birthplace you shall go. V'lakachta isha livni liyitzchak, and you should take a wife to my son, to Isaac. Okay, so here's something which is very interesting. Avram calls in his servant, and we might say his loyal servant, as we will certainly see, and he administers an oath. And the oath is that under no circumstances is he to take a wife from the Canaanites in whose midst Avram dwells for Yitzchak, and rather he should go to his land, to his birthplace, to find a wife. Now, I just want to point out, and we don't have the time to do this, and I don't want to get sidetracked because I've already gotten a little sidetracked. If you look at our parsha, you'll see a lot of very interesting parallels between not only this story, I mean, in terms of the language, but also in terms of the beginning of the parsha with Ma'arat HaMachpelah, to what you find later on in Parashat Vayechi. In the parsha, which essentially describes the death of Jacob and ultimately his burial in the land of Israel. And for our purposes, one of the things which is very interesting is that in that parsha, Jacob calls Joseph, and I'll just give you the reference right now. If you look at it should be chapter, just give me 1 second. This is chapter 47. Chapter 47, verse 29. It says that as Israel is about to die, he calls his son Joseph and says, if I have found favor in your eyes, put your hand below my thigh and do not bury me in Egypt. And then he goes on to say, I want you to take me to the land of Canaan, bury me in my family plot. And Joseph says, I will do as you say in verse 30. But in 31, Jacob says, Hishavali, take an oath. So I just want you to see we have a similar situation. In both cases, you have somebody who is very close to you, who's very loyal to you. You have a mission which you want them to undertake. Over here, it's to find a wife for Isaac. Over there, it's to bury Jacob. And over here, there's the insistence, do not take a wife from the land of Canaan. Over there, it's do not bury me in the land of Egypt. There's also the flip side. Over there, bury me with my family. Over here, go back to my land and my birthplace. And in both cases, there's an oath which is administered, which seems very strange. Why do you have to make the person take an oath? That would seem to indicate that you don't trust them. But actually, in both places, the reason for the oath is, number one, to impress upon the individual how serious the demand is. And it actually is for the good of that individual, because it then pushes them to see to it that they get the job done, that under no circumstances do they find maybe some way out, right? Extenuating circumstances to not achieve their mission. So I just want to point out that, in other words, when somebody makes you take an oath, rather than seeing this as an expression of I don't trust you, see as an expression of trying to impress upon the individual how important this is and how much, right? I want you to see that this has to get done. And the only way you'll realize how it has to get done is if I administer an oath. Now, over here, there's a very interesting question as to why is Avraham so insistent on not getting a wife from the Canaanites. And in the commentaries I gave you on the second page, there are a number of different explanations, and I'm not going to start getting into a whole discussion about it for the moment, but I just want you to see what you have. So, for example, you have the Radak on the second page, number 4, who says that the reason why Avraham doesn't want Yitzhak to marry a Canaanite is because the Canaanites are cursed and the seed of Avraham is blessed. And it's not appropriate that the two seeds should mingle together, right? The Canaanites have been cursed by Noah, that they are destined to be slaves, okay? And Isaac is to be blessed, in fact, to be a quote unquote ruler. So how can you mix it, right? It's what we call shatnes, okay? Two different things that shouldn't go together. Okay, to a certain extent, that sounds a little bit racist to our sensibilities. If you go down a little bit, there's another commentary, the Chizkuni, who, number 6, who says, I'm sorry, not the Chizkuni, but the Ktav Kabbalah, number 7, who says that the reason why Abraham doesn't want to have him marry a Canaanite is because the Canaanites were known for their terrible attributes, their distorted belief system, okay? And therefore, what Avraham was very, very concerned with, so it's not about, quote unquote, nature, but it's about nurture. It's the fact that there are people who have, a certain degenerate lifestyle, and that's something which is they're going to then transmit to the children, so he didn't want him to get involved with that. Okay, it's interesting that, and if you look at number 8 at the end, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch also says something similar, that there was a tremendous gap between the lifestyle of Abraham and the lifestyle of the Canaanites. But he adds another, what we would call knitch, another added dimension, where Avram says, do not have Yitzhak get married to the people in his midst. Because what he says is, Isaac is living in an environment of Canaanites. And if he marries a Canaanite, then in the end, to a great extent, they will be the dominant, what we would call dominant culture. And his children, they'll be assimilated into that culture, which means it's not only that they have these terrible qualities, but in other words, but they are the dominant culture. So that if you bring in somebody from the outside, even if she comes from a background which is not so great, but she's being brought into Isaac's frame of reference rather than vice versa. Okay? And then you have one last thing which is cute. Number 6, the Chizkuni, who says that Avram didn't want him marrying a Canaanite because they would say that Abraham's claim to the land of Israel was not based on his relationship to God and God's promise of the land, but because he simply married into the local population. And therefore, Abraham wanted to be very clear that if eventually he will take possession of the land of Israel, it's only because it is the gift of God to him, rather than something that he married into, so to speak. Okay? In any event, what I want you to see is that Abraham is insistent. And maybe let me also just add, if we take perhaps the conglomerate of all these explanations, to a certain extent, I mentioned earlier, Abraham is zaken, he is wise. We see the wisdom of Abraham, which means that Abraham is very concerned about who Yitzchak will marry and is trying to look, right, in terms of the long-term ramifications. And so that Abraham is very insistent, right? In other words, that you have to be extremely careful because he wants to make sure, he wants to, one might even say guarantee, okay, that Yitzchak will, Yitzchak's children will in effect perpetuate his legacy. So this is Avraham. Now, I also want to point out that Avraham tells this person, go to my land, go to my birthplace. And this is actually going to become a big issue, and I want to point it out right now, okay? Because the question is, did Avraham actually want him to get somebody from the family? Or was it that Avraham simply said, get somebody from where I came from, without necessarily emphasizing the family? And this is a discussion among different commentaries, and I would like to put on the table right now that the simplest way of taking what Avraham says is that Avraham said, simply go to my land, my birthplace. Avraham never mentions going to his family. And we'll see why I am making such a big deal about this. We'll see this in a little while. In any case, this is what Avraham is insistent upon, that he wants the slave to take an oath regarding. Now, let's look at verse 5. Vayomer elav ha'eved, then the slave says to him, or the servant, I should say the servant, Ulai lo toveh ha'isha lelechet acharai la'aretz hazot. Perhaps this woman will not want to go after me to this land. Hehashev ashivet bincha la'aretz asher yatzata misham. Should I return your son back to the land which you left? And in verse 6, Vayomer elav hishamer lecha, beware, pentashivet b'ni shama, lest you return my son there. Okay, so now I want to say the following. We already begin to see that this servant is somebody special. Generally, when you have the impression of a servant, it's the idea of somebody who you give orders to, they follow orders. And what we see over here is that the servant has a mind of his own. And the servant, okay, is already anticipating certain scenarios, and he wants to be able to know, like, what are the guidelines of his mandate? And in effect, what he says is, well, what if she doesn't want to come here? Should I take Yitzchak back there? And Avraham's response is, absolutely not. So therefore, what I want you to see is that the model which we have over here of a servant is not somebody who simply follows orders, but of somebody who actually has a mind of his own, of somebody who's already anticipating the different possibilities and wants to know how to deal with that. And therefore, let me point out that if in fact someone is a real servant, then it's their job, their mission to get the job done to the best of their abilities. But to get the job done to the best of your abilities means that you need to anticipate all the possible scenarios, and then how am I going to deal with it? And what we find over here is he wants to get the guidelines from Abraham. He wants to know what are the absolute red lines you can't cross. And therefore, I would also like to add over here that Abraham is absolutely insistent, okay, that under no circumstances does Yitzchak leave the land of Israel, does Yitzchak go back to that place. Now, by the way, I just would like to add, this may also explain why Abraham doesn't just let Yitzchak go back there, or doesn't even instruct Yitzchak to go back there, because from Abraham's perspective, Yitzchak should not be leaving the land of Israel. And in fact, I've mentioned this in other podcasts, that Yitzchak is the only one of the patriarchs who was born, bred, dies in the land of Israel. And therefore, Avram sees it being absolutely essential that if Yitzchak is going to be the one who carries on his destiny, he's the one who must do it in the land of Israel. So this is something which is non-negotiable. So I just again want you to see, here is Abraham, who in a certain sense is giving very clear guidelines. On the one hand, he's insistent he doesn't want Yitzchak to get married to a Canaanite. And on the other hand, he's insistent that Yitzchak should not leave the land of Israel. And now let's look at the next thing. Zion, verse 7. Abraham then goes on to say, Hashem Elokei Hashamayim asher lekachani mibeit avi, Hashem, the God of heaven, who took me out from my father's house, u'me'eretz moladati, v'asher diber li, and the one who spoke to me, v'asher nishba li lemor, and who swore to me, saying, Lezaracha atein et ha'aretz hazot, to your seed I will give this land. This is chapter 12, verse 6. So that God who said to me, I will give this land to your child, hu yishlach malacho lefanecha, v'lakachta isha livni misha. Okay, and you will take a wife for my son from there. Okay, now it's very interesting that the Ibn Ezra, if you look at the second page on this verse, says that when Avram says God will send a messenger and see to it, right, that you will find the right woman. So the Ibn Ezra says tefillah. This is a prayer on behalf, this is Avram's prayer. And then he says, V'ilu hayta nevuah, and if this is a prophecy, lama amar v'im lo toveh. Why does he say in the very next verse, and what if the woman doesn't want to go? Which means that the Ibn Ezra is saying, when Avram now says to the servant, right, you're saying, what should I do if she doesn't want to come? So Avram says, under no circumstances, take my son back there. And then what Avraham says in our verse is, and I pray to God that God will actually see to it that you find the woman, right, who, because God made a promise to me that he will give this land to my seed. But the Ibn Ezra says it's not that Avram's saying, don't worry, God will be with you. God is going to make it happen. It's an aspiration, it's a hope, okay? But it's this feeling that he has, that in other words, that given what he knows about God, given the promise which God made, that I have this feeling, I pray that God will actually be with you and make it happen. But now look at the next verse, verse 8, Chet. But Avram then says, Vim lo toveha isha lelechet acharecha, and if the woman will not desire to go with you, v'nikita mishvuati zot, you'll be acquitted of this oath. Rak et beni lo toshev shama, but only my son do not bring back there, which means that Avraham makes it absolutely clear, no matter what happens, do not take Yitzchak back. On the other hand, Avram also says, If the woman, when you go there, is not willing to come, okay, you'll be exempt from the oath. And so then the question becomes, so what does that mean, exempt from the oath? Now, there are two ways you could take it. One way is to say you're exempt from the oath. What's the oath? That you will not take a wife from among the Canaanites. Well, if the woman back there doesn't want to come, so now you have, free range to take a wife from among the Canaanites. The Ramban, if you look at the second page, the Ramban says, number 5, V'nikita mishvuati zot. It's not that Avram is now saying you have carte blanche, you have a license in that case to take a Canaanite wife, but rather you are now exempt. Your mission is over. And then I leave it in the hands of God who Yitzchak will get married to. And my preference is the Ramban's way of saying that, in fact, what Avram is saying to his servant, under no circumstances do you take Yitzchak back there. And on the other hand, under no circumstances do you get a Canaanite wife for him. I pray to God that God will be assisting you in finding the right woman to bring back here. But if it doesn't happen, then I then leave it in the hands of God to decide who Yitzchak will get married to. But you now have finished your mission. Now, I just want to point out what we have here is a very interesting combination, which we're going to see in much more detail in a few moments, of this combination of trying to do everything which is humanly possible, figuring out all the scenarios, thinking of what would be the ideal solution, who is the best candidate, the best wife that could be brought for Yitzchak, and at the same time realizing that even if you've drawn up your checklist of who the right person is, ultimately you need divine assistance so that you have, as the Ibn Ezra said, this element of prayer. Here, God, I know what I want. I know what my values are, but I need you to help to bring it to fruition. And I'm also prepared for the possibility that maybe it won't happen for whatever reason. It's not like I feel, well, of course, if I have the right values, God will guarantee it. God will make it happen. No, I don't have any guarantees. And then what I say is, I've done everything that I possibly could do. And if in the end, right, I found the woman, she doesn't want to come back. Okay, I tried as hard as I could. I now leave it in the hands of God. Let God decide how this will go further. Okay, so now let's look at what follows. Verse 9. So the servant takes the oath, and it seems to be that we're now ready to go. So now let's look at what we have. Verse 10. And the servant takes 10 camels from the camels of his master. Vayelech, and he goes. And all the goodies of his master in his hand. Vayakom vayelech, and he gets up and he goes to Aram Naharayim, El Ir Nachor, right, which is Abraham's land. Now, he takes 10 camels, loaded with all kinds of goodies, so to speak. Okay, and what are these goodies? These goodies are essentially, Rashi says it was actually, he has a document which says that Abraham is bequeathing to Yitzchak all that he has to show to whoever it is, right, that Yitzchak, in fact, will inherit everything. Other commentaries say that he has all kinds of silver, gold, okay, various things to take what we would call a sampling to show them of the wealth of Abraham. One of the things which is not at all clear from the verse is whose idea was to take 10 camels with all these goodies. Was this what Avram instructed him to do? Or is this what he did on his own? And I would like to suggest that because the Torah doesn't explicitly say that an Avram gave him all these different things, that this is what he did on his own, which is once again showing you the initiative that this servant has, that this servant realizes, and we'll see this more in a few moments, that it's not enough for him to find the right person, but at a certain point, he's going to have to be a good salesman. He's going to have to do his marketing. And if he wants to make sure that the family will agree, he has to be able to have a selling point. And so he's already anticipating, as I said, not only finding the right person, but once he finds her, how is he going to be able to then get the family to agree? And this is the initiative of Eliezer, the servant. Now, I want to just point out, in a certain way, if that's true, then he is actually mimicking Avraham. For those of you who recall, when God told Avraham in chapter 22, last week's Parashat, to go to do the Akedah. So Avraham accepts his mission to take Isaac, to bring him up as an offering. And if in fact you look, this is chapter 22, look at verse 3. It says, and Avram got up early in the morning and he saddles his donkey. He takes his lads with him in Yitzchak. And then he takes, he chops wood for the burnt offering. And they go to the place. And then what we find is that Avraham has not only wood, but later on you see that Avraham has, in verse 6, he also has fire. He has a knife, which means that what you see is that Avraham, if he's given a mission to bring up his son as an offering, he thinks ahead as to, well, what will he need in order to be able to do that? So he takes with him wood, he takes with him fire, he takes with him, or at least what's the ability to make fire, he takes a knife. And what you see is that evidently Eliezer, this servant, learned from his master that if he has a mission, he has to think ahead, what is he going to need? And so he saddles up these camels with all the goodies to go to where he needs to go. Okay, now because I see my time is starting to run out, so let's look further. So it says he comes to the place, the land, the birthplace of Abraham. And in verse 11, go back to reference 3, chapter 24, verse 11. And Eliezer, he has the camels lie down by outside the city, by a well towards evening when the girls who come to draw the water come out. And then look at what he does. Verse 12. Vayomar, and he says, Vayomar, Hashem Elokei Adoni Avraham, Hashem, the God of my master Abraham, Hakrena lefanah hayom, cause it to happen before me, and do chesed with my master Abraham. Hinei anochi nitzav al ein hamayim, behold, I am standing by the well, and the daughters of the city are going out to draw water. And behold, the girl who I will say to her, bring forth your jug, and I will drink, and she will say, drink, and I will also give your camels to drink. She is the one, this is verse 14, that you have, otah hochachta, you have proven to your servant, to Isaac, and in her I will know that you have done chesed im Adoni, kindness with my master. Okay, now, what I want you to see is, here is the servant who's picking up on what Avraham said. Avraham said, don't worry, God will send his messenger and he will help you find the right woman. And here is a servant who's not waiting. He's setting up what we could call a test and asking God to bring it to fruition. And essentially, what's the test? What is he looking for? He is looking for somebody who has the quality of chesed, of kindness. Okay, in last week's Parashat in the beginning, chapter 18, we saw that when Avram sees these three people, he immediately extends his hospitality to them. And that seems to be a major feature of Avraham, kindness, bending over backwards to give, to extend hospitality. So this is what he is looking for. Now, again, it's very, very interesting from what we see over here. If Avraham actually said to him, go to my family, then he should have gone to Avram's family. He knows who Avram's family is. And then once he got to the family, he should have then maybe checked out who's there, negotiated. But what you see is that he doesn't go to the family. Even before he comes to the family, he's asking God to show him, give him a sign of who the right person is. Now, in effect, he has set up the litmus test, and he has made that choice of who is the person most appropriate, because he knows that maybe the fundamental quality of Avram's house is chesed, and that's what he's looking for. And in essence, he's asking God, so bring me that person. Do that chesed with Avraham, that I will be able to connect. And then I will, because my time is running out, so we know from the continuation of the story, right, that lo and behold, right, if you look, as soon as he finishes his prayer, verse 15, Vayihu terem kila ledaber, even before he's finished speaking to God. So then in verse 15 it says, and behold, Rivka is coming out, who is born to Betuel, ben Milcah, Eshet Nachor, Achi Abraham, right? It's as if the Torah is telling me, and not only telling me who she is, she's from Avram's family. And then as we go on to see, right, it tells me all of her virtues. She comes from Avram's family, right? She's beautiful, right? And he runs towards her, verse 17, and he says, could you give me a little bit to drink? And then she says, drink, my master. And then she hurries up, right? If you look at verse 18, vat maher. And then when he finishes drinking, she says, I'll also give to your camels. And verse 20, vat maher, she hurries. Again, for those of you who are familiar with, if you go back to chapter 18, when Avraham is extending his hospitality, he's constantly hurrying, he's running, he's doing it with enthusiasm, which means that the way she is behaving is displaying everything that we saw about Avraham, which means that exactly what he was looking for is what she is now providing. And then what we find is, right, in verse 21, all of a sudden, we don't talk about the servant, but we talk about the ha'ish, and the man is in a certain sense dumbfounded. He's quiet. He wants to know, has God, okay, given success to his mission or not? And then when the camels finish drinking, the man takes, okay, a nose ring, which is made of gold, and bracelets. And then he says in verse 23, Bat mi'at, you are the daughter of whom? Tell me. And is there a place in your father's house for me to lodge over? And she tells him, she is the daughter of Betuel, the son of Milcah, who was born to Nachor. And she tells him, we have lots of place for you, lots of room, lots of food for your camels to be able to stay over. And then verse 26, and the man bows down and he prostrates to God. And 27, Vayomer Baruch Hashem Elokei Adoni Abraham, blessed you are God to Abraham, Asher lo azav chasto v'amito me'im Adoni, who did not abandon his kindness and truth from my master. Anochi baderech nachani Hashem, that I, on the path that God led me to the house of my father's brother. Okay, so what I want you to see is, what we have over here is how this servant set up the test. He prays to God to bring it to fruition. And in the end, when she says she is the daughter of Betuel, born to Milcah, okay, the wife of Nahor, he then bows down, thanks God, that God essentially led him to the right place. By the way, he uses throughout here the language of chesed and emet. So I would like to point out kindness and truth. And this is perhaps partially connected to one of the commentaries on the page, on the second page. What is the truth that you have over here? The emet is that God is now true. God is true that God has now shown him the appropriate wife for Yitzchak. The appropriate wife being a wife of chesed. She is the one to continue the legacy of Avraham. That's emet. What's the chesed? The chesed that she's from Avram's family. By the way, I just want to say parenthetically, it's fascinating that when Avraham begins what we would call his Jewish journey, which is Parashat Lecha, chapter 12, Avraham is essentially told to leave his family, cut himself off from his family, from his past, in order to be able to find who he really is. It's fascinating that when Avraham finally finds himself at the end of last week's Parashah, Avraham is now ready to be reconnected to his family. And the way that he's ultimately reconnected is through this marriage of Yitzchak and Rivka, which means that God did not want Avraham to leave his family forever. He needed temporarily to leave his family in order to be able to fully develop. But once he develops, he's then able to reconnect and reconnect forever through this marriage of Yitzchak. So this is the chesed which God is doing. Not only is she the right person as a person, but this is also chesed which goes above and beyond to be able to then reconnect the family once again. Now, as my time is running out, so I just want to point out, in the last verses, he is called the man. He's not called the servant. And so what I just want to point out, since our time is running out, and you'll excuse me, but you know I usually take another 5 minutes, so all the places where we describe him as the servant are the places where he is now acting as the faithful servant of Avraham. And usually it's when we're describing him in relationship to Avraham, even later when we see him in relationship to Yitzchak. It's when we see how he is doing all the things that he needs to do in the fulfillment of his mission, he is called the servant. When is he referred to as the man? It's when other people are looking at him. In this case, Rivka. Rivka does not see a servant. Rivka sees a man. The image that he projects to the outside world is not of a servant, but of majesty, of a man of distinction. And I just want to refer you to the verse which I mentioned earlier. If you look later on in verse 61, when Rivka finally goes with him, it says that she and her maids go after the man, because from beginning to end, the way they relate to him is as the man. But in the very same verse, it says, Vayikach ha'eved et Rivka. The servant takes Rivka because he is taking her now in his capacity as the servant, because this is the final fulfillment of his mission, his commitment to Abraham. And what's even more striking is look later on in verse 65. When after she sees Yitzchak, it says, Vatomer el ha'eved. She says to the servant, Mi ha'ish halazeh. Who is that man? Which means that when does Rivka relate to him as being a servant? Only when she sees him relative to Yitzchak. When she sees him in his own right, he is a man. When all of a sudden she sees him right next to, in comparison to Yitzchak, then all of a sudden she sees he's the servant. That's the man. Okay, I just want to make two more points, and I realize my time's up, and we'll conclude with that. From verse 34 onwards, we have the repetition of the story. And by the way, again, I just want you to look in verse 29, verse 30, okay? Verse 31, or actually 32. When Lavan sees this person, he sees a man. Not only does he see a man, but he calls him Baruch Hashem, the blessed of God. Which if you look in Parashat Lecha, in fact, if you look in that story, the 4 kings and the 5 kings, right? You'll see that in chapter 14 at the end, Melchizedek refers to Abraham as being the blessed of God. So again, the same term which was used vis-a-vis Abraham is now being used vis-a-vis the servant. You are the blessed of God. And as I said, they refer to him throughout as the man. But then when he starts telling his story in verse 34, he says, Eved Avraham Anochi, I am the servant of Abraham. Okay, and I'm sorry I didn't get to this, but if you now read through his retelling of the story, you'll see that there are all kinds of subtle differences between how he tells the story and how it actually happened. And what I would say is the common denominator in all of the differences is that he's really trying to make a sell and to really play up how wealthy Abraham is, how much Abraham, right, loves his son and is in fact giving everything to his son, how much it's in their interest to conclude the deal. And not only that, but he plays up how important it is to Abraham to get somebody from the family. So it's as if he gives them an offer that they can't possibly refuse. So, what did I want to show you today? What I wanted to show you today is that while on the one hand, what we're doing is trying to show you the story of how Yitzchak found his wife. But in fact, the essence of this whole section is to really show you this personality. And I would say that the Torah, what's the word I'm looking for? Consciously. The Torah consciously does not tell me this person's name, because the Torah doesn't want you to hear his name, because the name here is irrelevant. And in fact, I'd even say his name is irrelevant here because it's not about him. It's actually about his master and about him being the faithful servant of his master. He is from beginning to end the servant of Abraham. And what does that mean to be the servant of Abraham? He has imbibed Abraham's personality. He has taken on Abraham's persona. And you see that in terms of his wisdom, in terms of his faith, in terms of his initiative, in terms of his determination. He has observed Abraham. He has done everything in the way that Abraham would have done this. And therefore, because he has taken on the persona of Abraham, when people look at him, they don't see him as a servant. They see him as being a man of distinction. They see him as somebody who has majesty. And yet, despite the fact that they see him as being majestic, he maintains that humility. And when he then presents himself, I am the servant of Abraham. It's not about me. It's about my master. It's about my mission. Why is this so important? It's so important because his relationship to Abraham becomes a model for us as to what our relationship with God should be. Look at how he has taken on the persona of Abraham. So maybe that's what our mission in life is, to become the servants of God. The more that we try to take on the attributes of God, to become God-like, but God-like in terms of what we see about God, God being compassionate and kind, being wise, being just. The more that we take on those qualities of God, we become God-like, we become majestic. But the point is, the purpose of our majesty is not for self-glorification. The purpose of our majesty is ultimately, from beginning to end, to bring about that recognition of God and the majesty of God. It's not enough for the Torah to just give us all the laws, as I started out. Yes, there are many laws that the Torah gives us, and many laws are given to us with subtle hints. The laws are very important. But what ultimately is more important are not the laws, but the personality that we develop. What does it mean to be a servant of God? It's not just following the rules and regulations. It goes far beyond that. What does it mean to be a servant of Abraham? It's not just getting the orders and then carrying them out. It goes far beyond that. And that's what I was trying to show in this story. And therefore, this becomes the model for us. Before the Torah and Shemot and the rest of the Torah give us all the 613 commandments, it's important to see we're much more than just the sum total of doing this law or that law. The whole purpose is to create a type of person. And that type of person is somebody who in the end should be majestic, who people will look to in awe. But when they do that and they're asked, who are they? They will say, I am the servant, in this case of Abraham, and our thing is to say, we are the servants of God. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Okay, to remind everyone, next week is Erev Thanksgiving. So since this is the American Chag, so we will not have a session. We will continue 2 weeks from now, and I'll be recording from New York. Yes, Sandra. Okay, few minutes for questions, comments.
Thank you. First of all, thank you. Second of all, on the issue of the Eved's name, his name isn't simple. It's actually part of the issue, because his name is God helped me. And that makes him the apotheosis, the actual emblem of what Moses, who's the prototypical Eved Hashem, is trying to impress on Bnei Israel in Deuteronomy at the end of his life when he's giving his last will and testament. He's always saying, and when you get to the land and when you get rich and when everything is good for you, remember who really did it. You really are Avdei Hashem. God really did it. So this is actually mind-boggling, because this servant's name isn't Eved Avraham. It's Eliezer. It's not Avraham Ezer, or I don't know what kind of Ezer, but it's really so. I'd have to say that the name is, oh goodness, it's hidden. Maybe it's a sod. Maybe it's only the Midrash that would find it. But I think it's so fabulous that it really summarizes and holds at the top of the mountain the essence of what you're saying. You're saying we have to be Avdei Hashem. That's the piece that we have to take away. And here he was that. This is what he was, only it was hidden. Anyway, that's what I was thinking while you were talking.
You're absolutely right. I would just add to what you're saying, okay? And maybe it's also not mentioned here, right? You'll excuse the trite expression, but maybe the point of this section is God helps those who help themselves. And maybe the point that it's making is to be a real Eved Hashem means, it's not God is going to help me, God is going to provide. It's that I have to do everything which is humanly possible. I have to demand the maximum for myself. And then, yes, as you see in the story, when he demands the maximum of himself, does everything possible, there's a certain point where he turns to God and says, God, please make it happen, because I know that ultimately I'm not able to determine the outcome, which is also true with us. But I think there's also a kind of danger, so to speak, of being caught up with God will help. We shouldn't be putting it on God. We have to be the ones who do everything which is humanly possible. And as I said, the humility is the realization that no matter what we do, ultimately, yes, it will not happen without God's help. So that's why I think the two things actually complement each other. And I think you're right. The idea of God helping is in the background, and clearly he acknowledges that. But it may also be that the emphasis in the story is not to emphasize so much the help of God as much as what we need to be doing before we get to that.
Maybe a test. Maybe the leitmotif of this whole thing is setting up tests.
Absolutely. And the idea being, and that we have to be the ones who are prepared to now go through those hurdles. Absolutely. In a similar way to Avraham. Okay. I think Avraham, again, was the role model, that Avraham was the type of personality who would, if you use the language, resort as a last resort to God. It was like first do whatever is humanly possible, and then realize that after I've exhausted every possibility, it's now in the hands of God. And that's why even what we said in this situation, Avram says to him, I pray to God that God will help you, but I don't know. So if God in the end, right, didn't help you out with this girl, then you've done whatever you can do, and then it's really is in the hands of God. But until we come to that point, you have to do everything that you possibly can. And that's what I think he demonstrates.
Okay. Thank you.
One quick thing from this Parsha and a couple quick things from last time when we didn't have a chance to do the discussion part. That the whole idea when you were going back to what Avraham had to leave in Lecha and the reconnection with his family. The phrase "mi beit avicha" might not mean leaving his father, it might mean leaving the trappings of his father's house. So it might not have been a negative against his father, who already had a faith process going on. You pointed that out earlier. It might be that he had to establish his own identity. So
Yes.
that's in terms of this week. In terms of last week, there were just a couple of very quick things that jumped out at me. Talking about Sodom, the same letters that make Sodom make disam, which means a medicine or a remedy. So to me, that shows that even though they ended up being terrible, that it didn't have to go that way. That there's always the possibility of tshuva. That something that seems like it's really negative. That there's also the potential to find a remedy.
Yes.
So that's in terms of that.
And by the way, I would also you point out, since you're bringing it up. So again, this whole story with Rivka becomes the inverse of the story of Sodom. In other words, here is Sodom, which is a place which is completely lacking chesed, and here's Rivka, who becomes, in a certain sense, the embodiment, and in effect showing that chesed can exist, okay, outside of Abraham, okay, and it's in his family who's way back there. And by the way, it's certainly if you were to go to 2 weeks from now, Parashat Vayetze, which we will discuss. Okay, in other words, the environment that she comes from is also a place which is totally lacking in chesed, and so that she really stands out in showing that even in a place which is totally lacking in chesed, you can have somebody who's doing chesed. Okay, and I would even say that she might even be in contrast with Lot that we had last week, because we mentioned that Lot was not exactly rushing to do things, right? And here is she, who's, okay, it's not exactly the same type of environment, but she is acting freely, okay, displaying her chesed, despite that's at odds in a way with, where she is.
Yeah, and also the oddness of the king of Sodom is saying that he'll take the souls. It made me think that it's kind of a provocative thing, because what he's now interested in taking is what's most precious to Abraham. So I see that almost as a provocation. And then going back to Lot, the difference between Lot and Abraham, with the seeing. With Abraham, he lifts up his eyes and sees Vayisai and Vayar, and with Lot it says Vayar Lot, so it's almost saying Lot sees himself.
Okay, yes, or he has limited vision. Let's put it that way. Yes, definitely. Okay, everyone, you should have a wonderful day. For those of you who are in Israel, have a wonderful evening. Okay. For the Americans among you, happy Thanksgiving. Okay, and lehitraot in 2 weeks from now. Shabbat shalom.
Thank you.
Rav Meir Nisiot Tovot. Maybe you'll see you in LA.
We'll be in touch.
Thank you very much.
Be well. Called him.